Okay.
What there is, though, and this gets into something else that Eisenhower orders and becomes sort of standard American and British response when these camps are discovered, is that the civilian population of Gotha is ordered to visit the camp. And right away, the Americans, the Fourth Armored and 89th Infantry, who liberate the camp, who discover the camp, they report this as well because they also take Gotha. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that these units are usually only in an area for a day or two, and then they're the spearhead. They're moving forward, so there are other units that are following them. But almost from the get-go, Americans are encountering both in Gotha for Ohrdruf, but at every camp, German civilians saying they didn't know anything about this. They had no idea what was going on. And you see instantly as well this reaction from American GIs and officers, and Patton shares this and some of his correspondence as well, that they're liars, that there's no way they didn't know. One of the things that Americans in particular talk about, but since today, the day we're recording this is April 15th, we should also give a shout out to the Brits who liberate Bergen-Belsen 80 years ago today.
Yep.
This is something that comes up in their correspondence, their discussion as well, is the smell. You smell the camp before you see the camp. And it's because of the death and the decay and the just horrible sanitary conditions that are existing in these camps. And so there's this widespread disbelief that how could you not know? Plus, these communities, Gotha is no exception to this, they benefit economically from having a camp located nearby. They've got workers for local factories, for businesses, for farms. They know. And in some cases, the prisoners are in charge of reconstruction. If a town or a city's bombed, it's the prisoners who go out and defuse bombs or clear rubble. They're marching sometimes through the town every day. The Germans know. But I bring that up simply because the mayor of Gotha, who is forced to go and visit, and in most cases as well, the U.S. Army, creates civilian work details to bury the dead. In one instance, and I can't remember which unit, they actually order the bodies brought from the camp to the center of town, and the dead prisoners are interned in the town park that's in the middle of the town, by order of the commanding officer, because he says, you people are never going to forget what you did or allowed to be done in your name. Like, this is, the greatest sin possible, and so this shall serve as a memorial. But in Gotha's case, the mayor, after he visits the camp, will go home. He and his wife commit suicide, but he leaves a note, and Patton, the note's passed on to Patton. Patton quotes it to Eisenhower, and he says, "We knew, but we didn't know." We knew about the camp. He admits that they knew about it, but he claims he didn't know what was going on in the camp. And there's this sort of widespread, sort of incredulous take that how could the Germans believe that we would believe that they didn't know what was going on, literally, next door to their communities. So in that sense, there is justice, to a certain degree. But I think encountering the camp for himself also heightens Eisenhower's desire to make sure that in the post-war period, and I think that's another important thing to keep in mind, we're still fighting the war here. We're still weeks away from May 7th, when the Germans surrendered to Eisenhower. So he's got a war to fight, and so and on some level, thoughts of justice, trials, all that's going to be a post-war thing, but it's also going to be something that Eisenhower is going to set American precedent for, whether or not we always follow it in the years to come.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story there about the mayor of Gotha, because when I read the book, that was something that just struck me. You know, that them saying they didn't know, and then committing suicide and leaving the note. You know, we didn't know, but we knew. You know, it was talk about a powerful statement and an emotional moment, even for somebody reading this 80 years later. It's just amazing to consider. Do we know if Eisenhower ever visited any other concentration camps? Did he personally go through any camps besides Ohrdruf? I mean, I think this is related to what you just said about, as horrible as this is, and as much as this impacts Eisenhower, he is also still the Supreme Allied Commander who is still fighting a war that is not yet over. So, as you said earlier on, this is one more thing out of probably a million things that come his way every single day. So, does he ever get the chance to visit any other camps that we know of?
So there is you find this in the literature. There's mention of him visiting Buchenwald shortly after it was liberated. To the best of my reconstruction, that was not him. That was his son, John. John comes for a visit. He's in the army, but he comes and it's shortly after Buchenwald is liberated, and Eisenhower says you should go see one of these for yourself. Now they do have a fairly strong resemblance to one another, and I think there's reason. Like, well, there was Eisenhower was here. Well, okay, well, you can see how. To my knowledge, he doesn't visit any other camps during the war. After the war is over, while he's military governor, he does visit several of the displaced persons camps, which are often former camps themselves that have been sort of converted into the DP zone. But yeah, we're talking about something that happens on April 12th. We're in a countdown mode here. Again, looking back, we know we've got 2.5 weeks, maybe 3 weeks until the end of the war. He doesn't know that. And so he's not doing another press junket. He's not going here, there. It's one of the reasons I think he was so adamant that there are these congressional tours and other VIP tours, is that he wants other people going and seeing so that they can talk about it. So it's not just him. Plus, as we've discussed, he's got a million other things he's got to do.
Right. And I appreciate you mentioning John Eisenhower, his son, because, we talk about John here quite a bit as well. And of course, John Eisenhower famously graduates from West Point on June 6, 1944, D-Day. And of course, kind of, we always kind of laugh about, well, yeah, unfortunately, his dad couldn't make it to the graduation. He had a few other things going on that day. So, but, John Eisenhower, after graduation immediately goes to Europe and is on General Eisenhower's staff for a time, and supposedly took a lot of photos in some of the camps as well. I don't think we don't have those here, unfortunately, but we're aware that they exist. So let's look a little bit forward here then, because something else that I really liked about your book is it doesn't end at the end of World War II. You do take Eisenhower forward, including into the presidency. So what impact did this experience of visiting Ohrdruf and all of this firsthand knowledge about the horrors of the Holocaust, what impact did this have on them? Did they impact him, for example, later when he was commanding NATO, or even when he was running for president? What is this? How does this impact Eisenhower moving forward, through the rest of his military career and then into his presidential career as well?
So I think we can break that up into sort of the immediate post-war period and then the presidency very, very easily. In the immediate post-war period, Eisenhower spends 5.5, 6 months as the first U.S. military governor in occupied Germany. So he really sets the tone for not just how the U.S. is going to occupy its zone, but because I think especially because he had been Supreme Allied Commander, it takes this. It's a much wider berth, right? It's going to carry extra weight. it's Eisenhower who really takes the lead at setting up what denazification is going to look like. That gets, to a large extent, I mean, he's not creating this on his own by any stretch of the imagination, but he's the one who's signing off and making sure that it's as clear as possible that the Nazis aren't going to be allowed to sort of come back in any way, shape, or form, and it gets copied or is replicated, maybe is a better way to put it, by especially the British and the French. And so in some respects, even though he's just the governor of the U.S. occupation zone, he's still sort of supreme Allied commander too. People are looking to what the Americans are doing. Denazification takes a lot of work. It's not as clear cut as we would maybe like to think it is. How do you decide who is a Nazi? Are you a German? Thus you're a Nazi? If you served in the armed forces, were you a Nazi, or were you just on the other side? I mean, but you did have that swastika armband, but that was part of your unit. Like, we have to figure all this stuff out. What does it mean if you held elected office from 1933 to 1945? Okay, well, you had to join the party, but did you have to join the party, or did you have to join the party? And what do you do, especially, and this is especially true when we're talking about millions of displaced persons. They have to be cared for. The Germans have to be cared for because we've eliminated their government. So now taking care of Germans is on the Allies. You need some sort of civil administration. Where do you find those people? Do you keep the mayor? What about school teachers? Like, how do you recreate a society? Eisenhower has to start the grappling process with all of that and figure out how do you actually take out this cancer that was Nazism and pull it away from and out of German culture and the German populace. It's a little bit easier when it comes to, and I'd like to hit on this because I think it's important, because again, I think it's something we sort of take for granted. There's a reason why the International Military Tribunal trials are held at Nuremberg, and it's really Eisenhower. Nuremberg's in the American zone of occupation. We had discussed for several years that we were going to put leading Nazis, if we won the war, we were putting them on trial. The Allies had agreed to it. It had been talked about in public proclamations. Well, now it's time to actually hold those trials. The Soviets want to hold the trials in Berlin, and there's of course some symbolic reasons to do just that. Hold the trial in the enemy capital, especially maybe after it's discovered that Hitler's committed suicide, and we're not going to be able to put him on trial. But so let's put everybody else on trial. Let's keep it in Berlin. Eisenhower's really instrumental in making sure that doesn't happen, and he's going to make a couple of arguments that are still sort of trying to keep the alliance together, but also making sure that even though we aren't in the Cold War just yet, that we got an American spin on this, and that is, we can't let the trials happen in the Soviet zone of occupation. They will turn into, and we knew about this, Americans knew about this, they will turn into Stalinistic kangaroo courts in which there's no sort of process of the law that is applied at all. It's just the prosecution yelling at the, in some respects, no better than what the Nazis were doing either, right? That's an authoritarian dictatorship style of the law. That's not the American way of the law. So we have to be able to control the sort of optics of the trial. It has to look like a trial and function like a trial, which means we have to have not just prosecutors, but also defense attorneys, and the defense has to be able to mount a defense and all that. And what better place to do that than in the American zone, so that we can control those sort of proceedings. But he's going to make practical arguments as well. Nuremberg is not as destroyed as Berlin is. We have the logistics to help bring all the judges, the prosecution side. We will help find lawyers for, like, we'll do all the stuff. We'll put everybody up. We'll make sure everybody's got food. He even makes sure that the defense attorneys are going to be paid. So there's that aspect of what becomes known as the Nuremberg trials, which, again, I think, because we often refer to those trials as the Nuremberg trials, and then if you take the time to say, oh, that's in the American zone, well, of course it was going to be in the American. It didn't have to be. It's really Eisenhower maneuvering to make sure that the trials are held there. And then there's just the other aspect of this time is, part of it has to do with the trials, but part of it has to do with moving forward and is related to denazification, and that is the collection of evidence about the crimes that the Nazis committed. The chief American prosecutor, Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, at one point, he and Eisenhower meet fairly early on in the summer of 45. And by the time the trials are getting ready to start, Jackson tells the American, we don't need any more evidence. Like, we have more evidence that, like, you've collected too much. Like,
wow, that's not something you normally hear from a prosecutor.
Yeah. There's just so much of it because the Germans had kept such meticulous records, and we were able to get a hold of so many of those records. And he doesn't need any more evidence to try people. So that sort of collection, as a historian, it's like, oh, this is great. Like, we preserve, like, we have an archive. That's really has Eisenhower's hand in it as well. So there's that sort of immediate impact. He's sort of setting the precedent for what the other Americans, including one of his aides who will go on to become the governor, General Clay, will do during their time. And those are all in very real ways related to. We haven't mentioned this, but in the summer of 45, there are going to be reports about what is happening in these displaced persons camps. In particular, there is talk about how there are Jews that are here we are, say, maybe in June. So the war's been over for over a month, and Jews are starting to get word out that the camps are seemingly no better than when the Nazis ran things. It's just the Americans. They're still in these camps. They're not in everything. President Truman is going to have the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a guy named Harrison, do a visit. He's going to visit in the summer of 45. He's going to issue a report, the Harrison report, that is pretty scathing towards the Army and how they were treating these prisoners, especially Jewish prisoners. And Eisenhower is going to write a rebuttal in the fall of 45, arguing that, Harrison was there, the war was hardly over. And so, no, the Army had not shifted into everything. And you can read the report and be like, this is a great snapshot of that time. You can also understand why Eisenhower's back went up a little bit in terms of, hey, this guy comes over for a couple of weeks, a few weeks after the end of the war, but this is what the public is hearing, is that it's not the conditions anymore. He also makes changes to those displaced persons camps, and he has a Jewish aide that is appointed to help with Jewish prisoners or former prisoners in particular. And one of my favorite stories from that is he's visiting one of the DP camps in the fall of 45, and the camp, the Army is still has guards posted, maybe in particular because Eisenhower is going to be there. And Eisenhower calls the American officer over who's running the camp and says, you can take those machine guns down because I don't have any enemies here. These are my friends. And that is something that displaced persons who heard it, who were there when it happened, they take that to heart. Like, oh wait, he sees us as his friends, not as these people he's got to care for.
Right.
And so that's sort of the immediate post-war period. And then, you asked about his presidency. The war is the defining event of Eisenhower's professional life in a lot of respects, and to a degree, maybe even his personal life. And sort of, I think, being a husband, a father, and especially a grandfather, which I think he maybe enjoyed the most, was being a grandfather. But he comes away from the war with this notion that we can't fight another war like that again. I know the library has the, I hate war like only a soldier can hate war quote. But it's not just that he hates war, it's that he hates what he saw and what World War II caused him to do. He hates, obviously, the camps. He's seen that sort of aspect of brutality. He's seen what the war has done, what fighting has done to his men, and he never disassociates the fact that, I was, I had to give those orders because I was a general. No. He for him that was personal. He knew that he was sending men into harm's way and that they died, were maimed as a result. He carries that burden with him, I think, for the rest of his life. But he's also seen what his orders do, not just to his men, but he's visited Germany, right? He as military governor, he ordered those bombings. I mean,
yeah,
as Supreme Allied Commander, right? That's
absolutely, yeah.
He's reduced cities to rubble, and knows that means that hundreds, thousands of civilians died, not just whatever a Nazi was, but thousands of people died because he approved this order, right? And I mean, he's crossed through Western Europe. He will visit Moscow. He's seen the destruction on the Eastern Front, if oftentimes only from, passing over on an airplane or a train. He's seen what the destruction is. He doesn't believe, especially after August and September, August of 1945, with the use of the atomic bomb to end the war in the Pacific. He doesn't see how that's possible for a third world war to be fought. So I think he wraps the Holocaust into the destruction of World War II in a way that says we can never have another war like this ever again. What I find very interesting about that, though, is that doesn't mean he's unwilling to fight wars. It's just we're not going to fight a war like that again. And so I think that when you're looking at Eisenhower as president and his use of what becomes, or what is by the time he's in office, the CIA, covert military operations, sort of trying to incite revolution and supporting things, that's Eisenhower's way of saying, well, we're still fighting, and we will support, our friends, but we're not necessarily, we're not going nuclear first. And so there's that aspect of it, but then there's just the aspect, especially in terms of the Holocaust, and we can talk a little bit more about his relationship with the newly created state of Israel, if you'd like. But
Yeah, for sure.
His Eisenhower receives the highest number of Jewish votes really that any Republican president in the 20th century receives, and a lot of that has to do with this sort of, he visited the camps, he liberated the camps, he visited, or it's this sort of trickle down relationship of, he's not an anti-Semite. Or maybe another way of thinking of it is, just because our family has voted for Democrats before, but this is Eisenhower. He's different. He's a different kind of Republican. We can vote for him. And the fact that he makes no bones about, I mean, he mentions his visit to Ohrdruf in speeches, specifically, especially when he's asked to address Jewish groups. He talks about, I've seen what happened, right, to your people, or maybe even to you. And there are other little things too, like, this is something I didn't know until I got into the book process itself. But in 1956, during the Hungarian uprising that was in part sparked by Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America that were under Eisenhower, when Hungarians are brought, or those who escape once the Soviet-led crackdown is imposed, the United States is going to bring a large number of those people to the U.S. As refugees. And Eisenhower is going to essentially, without ever saying it specifically, but he uses a lot of presidential authority to get around immigration laws in order to do that. And I would trace that back to this recognition that we failed. And this is something that he knew from his before the war, when he was in the Philippines, that U.S. immigration policy had failed, especially Jews who were trying to flee the Nazis. And especially by the time he was president, the communists are the same thing as the Nazis. They're both authoritarian dictators. They're both authoritarian systems. They're the same side, or two sides of the same coin. And he's not going to let that happen this time around. Those people are going, if they want to come to the U.S., we're bringing them to the U.S. And when I stumbled into that and actually got to talk to a Hungarian American who, as a child, had fled in '56. I think he was about 3 or 4 years old, and he talked about how they got to the U.S. and his family was profiled in Life magazine. Again, that was an Eisenhower thing. I want this documented and publicized so that people are making connections, like personal connections. These aren't just faceless immigrants or faceless people who are fleeing. This is somebody who's moving to the middle of the United States, to Indianapolis, and kind of follow their trajectory. And I asked him, I said, well, did your parents, what did they have to say? I mean, they arrived here, they're now new Americans. And he said, because my parents were never very political. They did not talk politics growing up. He said, but they never said anything. No one could say anything bad about Eisenhower in our house.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, you mentioned a couple things here I think are really important. First is, Eisenhower of course, wants to be a champion for peace, wants to be remembered as a man of peace, but was very much a Cold Warrior too during his presidency. And so when you're talking about, kind of how he felt about communism and the idea of bringing people that are fleeing communism to the United States, that tracks very well with him as a Cold Warrior. But you mentioned too, prior to World War II, he spends time in the Philippines. And I did not know this until I read your book, in fact, that the Philippines, as Jews were trying to escape the Nazis, there was an effort on the part of the Philippines to open up the Philippines to Jews who were trying to flee Nazism in Europe. Is that right?
Yes. President Corazon.
While Eisenhower is there.
Yeah. So the Philippines are in a very interesting place in the 1930s. The U.S. had acquired them as a territory after the Spanish-American War, had set the Philippines, so 1898, turn of the last century, which still is hard for me to say, but it's the turn of the last century.
Me too.
But there was a recognition that there had been a pro-independence movement from Spain before the war that we capitalized on, and then we were like, oh wait, we might need the Philippines as a military base and whatnot. So the U.S. had set the Philippines on this path towards full independence fairly early on, but still, they're still on the path. World War II is going to interrupt that path to a large degree. But they have their own sort of political class, their own political structure. There's still an American governor, actually, at the time, Indiana's former governor, Paul McNutt. I'll give a shout out to my fellow Hoosier. He's there. Eisenhower's there because Douglas MacArthur is helping run the Philippine sort of provisional military alongside the American military presence that's there. And Eisenhower is MacArthur's aide. And Ike and McNutt and President Corazon, they have I don't know if it was weekly, was a regular card game session. I think they played poker and some other things. But their other players around the table were American expatriates who were there, including the Frieder brothers, who are Jewish. They're running a cigar company in Manila. So Eisenhower's got Jewish American friends in Manila. There's a couple stories. There's a very small German colony in Manila. Obviously, they eventually get a German consul. He's not an ambassador, but a counselor who is an ardent Nazi, and he kind of organizes the German Club of Manila along Nazi lines. They kick out German Jews who happen to be there. And Eisenhower has a couple run-ins with him, but he also gets an offer that's proffered by his friends to. He's at the cusp here in the late 30s of trying to decide, does he want to stay in the army, an army that is, I mean, there might be another war, nobody knows. He's survived this long, sort of in the smaller army with an officer corps. He is getting tired of working for Douglas MacArthur, and so they make him a job offer that would have paid him, for the time, an astronomical amount. It sounds pretty middle class to us, but $60,000 a year. I think it was a contract for 10 years or something like that. I mean, it was a long contract, and his job was basically to help facilitate the resettlement of European Jews into mostly the Philippines, but also other areas. McNutt, as the American Consul General, has a lot of leeway with immigration laws because the Philippines are technically not part of the United States, even though they sort of also technically are. So he can massage things. President Corazon is on board. He sees it as an opportunity to get some very skilled technical know-how into the Philippines. Eisenhower ends up deciding to stay in the army. He comes back to the U.S. The rest will be history for him. But the outbreak of the war in the Pacific disrupts this overall plan. Just a small number of European Jews actually make it to the Philippines before war breaks out. But yeah, there's this discussion and thought that this might be something that not only that could happen, but that Eisenhower would have been a very active part of.
Wow, fascinating. So we're just about out of time here, but I do want to ask you one more question, and that is just I know that when you were doing research for the book, you did come here, you did do research. So if you could say just a few things about, what kinds of resources did you find here that were valuable, and what was the experience like for you coming here to do research? I should also note to those who are listening to this later on that Dr. Jason Lantzer is also going to be doing one of our Lunch and Learn programs here pretty soon, and that will be up on our YouTube channel at Ike Library, and you'll be able to find that there here in a couple of weeks, and it'll live there going forward, so you'll be able to go back and watch that no matter when you're listening. But yeah, just just tell us a few things about, what were highlights for you in terms of the research you were able to do here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library.
Look, I can't say enough good things. The library was tremendous. I mean, a lot of this project ended up running. I mean, first of all, the presidential library system is a jewel, and the Eisenhower Library, as I did work with the Eisenhower Library while I was in grad school. I did a project on the presidential library system, and the Eisenhower Library was the first one to respond. So it's always, I mean, I like that even more.
That's right. That's what we like to hear.
And so much of this project in particular ended up happening in the midst of the pandemic. And so the fact that despite the fact that we were quarantining and travel was restricted, the library was great with facilitating search requests and sending me things. I think I remember the first bundle arrived. I'd sent an email, and some things arrived in the mail not too long after, and I kept looking for, what do I owe? I mean, there's all this, like, it was a nice packet size of scans, and I sent an email like, oh, no, we were happy to do it. So it was just that kind of support that really did make this possible in a lot of ways. And I would say that next to the library, the number one, the library and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, I have to, even though that's not so much materials, but just, I mean, they were the point of inspiration for all this.
Absolutely.
The other source that I really, really relied on were the collected papers of Eisenhower. I wanted as much as possible. When I first started the project, I was going to be the sort of through line narrative but I was going to talk about all these other things. And it soon became evident to me that I was traipsing in two very different bodies of literature. There's the Holocaust sort of literature, and then there's World War II literature, and to a lesser extent, because Eisenhower was going to be the through line, there's the sort of Eisenhower/presidential literature as well. And that was going to be a project that was going to be a little too big for me to handle on my own research time. I need a team, kind of thing. So when I made the decision that it was going to really just focus on Eisenhower, that yes, we were going to talk about these other things, but always try and bring them back to how does that impact, or how is Eisenhower impacting those other things? The collected writings from really his very early on through his presidency and a bit beyond were super important to making sure that Eisenhower's voice remained not just a part, but a key component of everything else I put together. And the last thing I would say when it comes to sources is it's Eisenhower himself. He wrote books.
Absolutely. That's right.
And that is his, it's as close to his voice as you're going to get that isn't recorded. And that's I always tell my classes that I'm very concerned about where history of the or how history of the 21st century is going to be written in the future, because so much of our records are not going to survive, or they are never going to be captured to begin with. And I mean, you think about all the emails you write every day. If somebody's writing just the history of you at your job and your email account is wiped at some point, all that's gone, right? There's no way to reconstruct what you did or who you talked to. We don't write letters anymore. We don't
have as many newspapers either.
Yeah,
I mean, the
newspaper, right?
That's kind of dried up too. Yeah,
it's all and even this is a very, this is something that happened in the last year or two, but that hit me as a member of Gen X. MTV News took down their archive at one point. So like
I'm
all
an
of
extra
the
too. That hurts.
right, like that's they just took it off the internet. Did they wipe it? We don't, nobody knows. Not that I'm planning a book on MTV News anytime soon, but it was just the thought that it was there, right? I think we take for granted that the stuff on the internet is always going to be there, and that can go away or whatever. So it's a privilege to get to work with actual records. It's a privilege. It was a privilege to try, and it is a privilege to attempted to tell this story, because I think it's an important one. It's important for different reasons than what I thought when I started writing it. Let's put it that way. When I was working on it, I thought, well, this is, I'm doing the classic historian thing. I found something that needs to be worked on, and I'm working on it. Good. I thought maybe there was something in there about leadership, that maybe could speak to some people, and then suddenly it becomes very, very important to remember that Eisenhower is maybe the first American to articulate this notion that we can never let anything like the Holocaust happen again, and that we have that as an ideal, whether or not we always live up to it or not. And I think maybe that's now what makes this so important, and why I still like Ike.
Well, that's a great place to end, and I realize podcasts are all audio, but for those of you who are listening, I will let you know that Dr. Jason Lantzer has been wearing his "I Like Ike" pin on his jacket the whole time we've been talking, so very appropriate. The book is Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust: A History by Jason Lantzer. Dr. Jason Lantzer, thank you so much for all of your time today. I think this conversation could go on for hours because this is such a full and a rich topic, and it's a very timely topic, obviously, with this being the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the camps and soon the end of the war in Europe. So thanks for your scholarship on this. Thanks for your time today, and thanks for sharing all of this with our listeners here at Club Eisenhower.
Thank you, Todd.